The steel beams of the unfinished tower stretched toward the gray Seattle sky like broken promises. Building Inspector Vincent Carlisle stood at his office window, watching another approved construction site where safety violations had been swept under bureaucratic rugs. To him, Maria Santos was nothing more than an irritating insurance investigator, too idealistic, too stubborn to understand how the system really worked, but Carlisle had misjudged the quiet determination behind Maria's professional demeanor. Behind her careful questions and meticulous note-taking lay years of experience investigating corporate cover-ups. His casual dismissal of her safety concerns wasn't the end of her investigation. It was the beginning of his downfall. The rain drummed against the windows of the municipal building as Maria sat in the back of conference room B, her tablet balanced on her knee. She watched as Tommy Rodriguez, a young construction worker, shifted nervously in his chair before the city council. His hard hat sat on the table beside him, a small crack visible along its side. They knew the scaffolding was defective, Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Foreman Jackson told us to use it anyway. Said we were behind schedule and couldn't afford delays. He paused, swallowing hard. When I questioned it, Supervisor Mills laughed and said, "What's the matter, scared of a little height?" Maria's stylus moved steadily across her tablet screen, but her eyes remained fixed on Tommy. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly, how he avoided looking at the construction company representative sitting in the front row. These were textbook signs of workplace intimidation, patterns she documented in dozens of similar cases. In the gallery, Tommy's wife Elena clutched their toddler daughter, her eyes red from sleepless nights in the hospital. The community members filling the chamber leaned forward, some nodding encouragingly, others whispering prayers under their breath. The beam gave way while I was 30 feet up, Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. I fell through 2 levels of scaffolding. Broke my back in 3 places. The doctors say I'll never work construction again. Building Inspector Carlisle shifted in his elevated chair behind the council table, his expression carefully neutral beneath wire-rimmed glasses. His fingers tapped rhythmically on his folder as Tommy described each moment of the accident, each safety protocol that had been ignored. The evidence was devastating. 4 witnesses had confirmed the scaffolding violations. Engineering reports, though initially suppressed, clearly showed the equipment had failed multiple safety inspections. Even the company's own internal memos, obtained through a whistleblower, revealed management knew about the dangers but chose to ignore them to meet deadlines. When Tommy finished his testimony, an uncomfortable silence settled over the chamber. Maria watched Carlisle closely, noting how he avoided eye contact with the injured worker, how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The vote was unanimous in favor of the construction company. No violations found. No penalties imposed. Case closed. The chamber erupted. Elena Rodriguez screamed, her daughter crying in her arms. Community members shouted accusations of corruption and bias. Others simply sat in stunned disbelief, their faith in the system crumbling before their eyes. Carlisle pounded his gavel repeatedly, his face flushed with annoyance. Order. This hearing is adjourned. Construction company executives Mills and Jackson stood shaking hands with their corporate attorney. Mills caught Maria's eye and smirked, his expensive suit immaculate despite the emotional chaos around him. Jackson at least looked uncomfortable, though his relief was obvious. As the crowd filed out, still murmuring angrily, Maria made her way to the courthouse steps. Rain continued to fall, creating small rivers along the concrete. She took a measured breath before addressing the cluster of reporters and cameras that had gathered. Today's decision represents a complete failure of our safety oversight system, Maria said, her voice cutting clearly through the rain. The evidence against Pinnacle Construction was overwhelming. Inspector Carlisle's refusal to acknowledge these violations demonstrates a disturbing pattern of protecting companies that put profits over worker safety. Questions flew at her from all directions. What about the engineering reports? Would there be an appeal? Did she think this was part of a larger conspiracy? Maria answered each question directly, never raising her voice, never losing her professional composure. But inside, her anger burned steady and cold. She watched the Pinnacle Construction executives climb into their black SUV, noting the license plate number out of habit. Back in her downtown office that evening, Maria spread case files across her conference table. Her assistant, David Chen, sat across from her, his laptop casting blue light across his focused face. Papers covered every available surface, and the smell of takeout Chinese food lingered in the air. Close the door, David said quietly. Though they were alone on the 15th floor, Maria set down her coffee and did as he asked, noting the unusual tension in his voice. What couldn't wait until tomorrow? Instead of answering immediately, David moved to the windows and closed the blinds. The city lights outside created thin lines of illumination through the slats. I found something, he said, turning back to face her. Remember that construction accident in Tacoma 6 months ago? The one where 3 workers were hospitalized? Maria nodded. She'd reviewed that case during her initial research. Same company. Same inspector approving the site. Same pattern of ignored safety violations. David opened his laptop and turned it toward her. But here's what we missed. Look at this footage. The video was grainy security camera footage from across the street. Maria watched as the Tacoma accident unfolded, scaffolding collapsing, workers falling, emergency sirens wailing. But David paused the video just before the collapse. Watch this, he said, advancing frame by frame. See that man in the hard hat? The one walking away from the collapse zone 30 seconds before it happens? Maria leaned closer. The figure was distant, but something about his posture seemed familiar. That's Supervisor Mills, David said. He knew it was going to fail. He got himself to safety and left his crew to take the fall. Maria's hands gripped the edge of the table. The Tacoma footage had never been entered into evidence. The investigation had been closed quickly, with minimal media attention. She realized they'd been documenting a pattern of negligence that went far deeper than anyone had suspected. There's more, David said, his voice dropping even lower. I've been tracking the financial connections. Mills Construction Company has several shell corporations. They're all major donors to Carlisle's political campaigns. Maria began writing in her legal pad, her pen moving quickly across the yellow paper. The office was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and occasional traffic from the street below. The air felt charged with possibility and danger. After several minutes, Maria set down her pen and looked at David. A small, grim smile played at the corners of her mouth as she stared at the frozen video on his screen. We're going to need more than this, she said. But it's a start. The next morning, Maria stood before a crowd of reporters and community activists on the steps of City Hall. Rain had given way to pale sunlight, and her voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd. I am filing formal complaints with the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration against both Pinnacle Construction and Building Inspector Vincent Carlisle, she announced, holding up a thick folder of documents. These complaints detail years of systematic safety violations, along with evidence of deliberate cover-ups designed to protect corporate profits at the expense of worker lives. Another reporter called out, "Aren't you concerned about retaliation from Inspector Carlisle or the construction industry?" Maria's spine straightened. I've spent my entire career investigating corporate misconduct. I've faced intimidation before, but I will not be silenced when workers' lives are at stake. The questions continued for 20 minutes. By the time Maria returned to her office, her phone was buzzing constantly with interview requests and messages of support. But mixed among them were less friendly communications. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table helping her teenage son Alex with his calculus homework. The familiar routine felt comforting after the day's intensity. Mom, everyone at school is talking about your press conference, Alex said, looking up from his equations. My friend Jake said his dad works construction, and he thinks you're going to make things safer for guys like him. Maria smiled, watching her son's serious face. Alex had his father's methodical mind and quiet strength, but people said he had Maria's sense of justice. It's not about making anyone angry, Mijo. It's about making sure people face consequences when they put workers in danger. Alex nodded, suddenly serious. Some kids at school were saying the construction companies are really mad. That they might try to hurt our family. Maria reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. We're going to be fine. But Alex, if anyone approaches you or asks questions about my work, you come straight home and tell me, okay? The next few days brought a coordinated assault on Maria's credibility. Anonymous sources claimed she had falsified evidence in previous cases. Blog posts appeared suggesting she was being paid by competing construction companies to sabotage Pinnacle. The Seattle Business Journal ran an editorial questioning her motives and expertise. Maria sat in her home office documenting every false claim, preparing her responses. A car drove slowly past her house the third time that evening. She made a note of the license plate. Her phone lit up with a text from Elena Rodriguez. They're saying terrible things about you on the news. Are you okay? We believe in you. The support messages helped, but Maria knew the attacks would intensify. She'd seen this playbook before: destroy the messenger to protect the message. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. Maria was working late in her office when David burst through her door, his face flushed with excitement and exhaustion. You need to see this, he said, connecting his laptop to the conference room monitor. A source inside Pinnacle sent me this. The screen filled with email exchanges between Inspector Carlisle and construction executives. The messages were carefully worded but damning discussions of managing oversight concerns and ensuring favorable interpretations of safety regulations. One email from Carlisle to Mills read, "The Santos woman is becoming a problem. We need to accelerate our timeline." There's more, David said, pulling up bank records. Shell company payments to Carlisle's personal accounts. Consulting fees for a no-show job. Even payments for his daughter's private school tuition. Maria studied the documents, her legal mind cataloging each piece of evidence. Who's your source? Janet Morrison. She's worked in Pinnacle's accounting department for 12 years. She said she couldn't stay silent after seeing Tommy Rodriguez in the wheelchair at the grocery store. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, but Maria knew they had to be careful. One procedural mistake could invalidate everything. Set up a meeting, she said. Somewhere safe. And David, we tell no one else about this until we're ready to move. Janet Morrison was a nervous woman in her 50s, with graying hair and worried eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She met Maria and David at a small cafe in the Fremont district, choosing a corner table away from other customers. I've been documenting this for years, Janet said, sliding a flash drive across the table. Carlisle isn't the only inspector involved. There's a whole network: building permits, safety inspections, environmental assessments. They've turned the entire oversight system into a protection racket. Maria carefully placed the drive in her briefcase. Janet, you understand what this means? Once we go public, there's no going back. I understand perfectly, Janet replied, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. My own son works construction. If something happened to him because I stayed quiet. She shook her head. I couldn't live with myself. That night, Maria sat in her home office reviewing Janet's files. The scope of the corruption was staggering: dozens of construction companies, multiple city inspectors, years of falsified safety reports. Workers had been injured or killed while the people meant to protect them profited from their suffering. She thought about Tommy Rodriguez, confined to a wheelchair at 28. About Elena, working 2 jobs to support their family while fighting insurance companies for medical coverage. About all the other workers who'd never gotten justice because the system was designed to fail them. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, determined. The corruption ended now. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle buzzed with activity as news crews set up their equipment outside. Maria walked through the morning rain, flanked by David and her attorney, Marcus Webb. The flash drives containing Janet's evidence were secured in multiple locations, and copies had already been delivered to the FBI and Department of Labor. Inside the courthouse, Inspector Carlisle sat with his expensive legal team, no longer the confident bureaucrat who had dismissed Tommy Rodriguez's injuries. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he reviewed documents with his lawyers. The hearing began with Federal Prosecutor Sarah Kim outlining the government's case. The evidence was methodical and devastating: financial records showing years of bribes, email communications proving conspiracy, and safety inspection reports that had been deliberately falsified. When it was Maria's turn to testify, she spoke clearly and directly about her investigation. No dramatic accusations, no emotional appeals, just facts, presented with the precision of someone who had spent years building an airtight case. Inspector Carlisle's actions represent a fundamental betrayal of public trust, she said, looking directly at the federal judge. Workers like Tommy Rodriguez depended on him to enforce safety standards that would protect their lives. Instead, he sold that protection to the highest bidder. The defense tried to paint Maria as a publicity-seeking opportunist, but their attacks crumbled against the mountain of documentary evidence. Bank records didn't lie. Email servers didn't fabricate conspiracies. The pattern of corruption was undeniable. When the judge announced that federal criminal charges would be filed against Carlisle and his co-conspirators, the packed gallery erupted in cheers. Elena Rodriguez wept openly, holding her daughter. Tommy, in his wheelchair in the front row, smiled for the first time in months. 6 months later, Maria stood before a community gathering at the Rainier Community Center. The room was packed with construction workers, their families, and community activists. Banners reading "Worker Safety First" and "Justice for Tommy" hung from the walls. Vincent Carlisle was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison yesterday, Maria announced, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd. The construction executives who bribed him are facing their own trials, and new federal oversight procedures are being implemented across the entire Pacific Northwest. She held up a legislative document. This is the Worker Protection Act. It requires independent safety inspections, establishes whistleblower protections, and creates real penalties for companies that prioritize profits over people's lives. Tommy Rodriguez, still in his wheelchair but looking stronger, called out from the front row, "What about the other cities? How do we make sure this doesn't happen somewhere else?" "We stay vigilant," Maria replied. "We support workers who speak up. We hold our officials accountable. And we never forget that the system only works when people like all of you demand justice." As the formal meeting ended, people approached Maria with thanks and handshakes. A young construction worker introduced his pregnant wife, saying their unborn child would grow up in a safer world because of her work. Outside the community center, Maria and Alex walked slowly toward their car. The Seattle evening was crisp and clear, with stars visible between the scattered clouds. "Mom, are you going to keep doing this kind of work?" Alex asked, his voice thoughtful. Maria looked at her son, seeing the same sense of justice in his eyes that had driven her own career. "As long as there are people who need someone to fight for them, yes." "Good," Alex said, squeezing her hand. "The world needs more people like you." Maria smiled, thinking of Tommy Rodriguez, of Janet Morrison's courage, of all the workers who would go home safe because someone had finally held the powerful accountable. The corruption had been exposed, the conspirators faced justice, and the system had been forced to change. It wasn't the end of the fight. There would always be new battles for justice. But tonight, walking with her son under the Seattle stars, Maria Santos felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope.